The PlayStation 1, the very first console to ever tickle the 100 million units sold mark. And I mean tickle it, just reaching the mark at roughly 102 million sold. Not that these numbers are always necessarily exact, but when it was getting close to 100 million units sold, I always imagined some super fan bought 2 million more of them just to make sure. I mean, hey, I do my part to make sure nanners are the world's best-selling fruit, but while having impressive sales numbers is impressive, it won't guarantee your enjoyment, now will it? Or can it? Well, I tried pausing my game while playing to think about it, and yeah, it's okay, I guess. But in general, I think of sales numbers more as a success in reaching an audience than having a good product. Plenty of good things sell well, sure, but there's also plenty of good things that don't. For example, I'd argue the Sega Saturn in the US. In the case of the PS1, however, I do think the sales numbers are relevant in the context of it being a worldwide hit. Arguably, the first console that could claim such a distinction, with most consoles up to that point having substandard sales numbers in at least one of the major sections of the world, such as North America, Japan, or Europe. And tying into the console being such a global success, in my opinion, is the expansive amount of third-party support the console received from developers, making for a very robust and well-rounded library of games. Or, as some might say, a little bit of everything, which is helpful to have if you find yourself in a battle against everything, which, thanks to me in this video, the PlayStation 1 does. In a series of videos where, just for fun, I like to try and make the case for a particular console being the best there is. Almost like a lawyer, except nobody's going to jail, except for maybe anyone who's never played the PlayStation 1 before, a criminal offense to many members of the retro gaming community. People love the original PlayStation, and whenever the topic of greatest gaming console comes up, one of the most common answers I see people give is indeed the PlayStation. And right away, many people will say, why not the PS2? Because it could also play PS1 games. But then you can just say, why not the early George Foreman grills that could play PS1, PS2, and PS3 games? Backwards compatibility is certainly awesome, but along with compilations, it always makes these discussions a mess. Next thing you know, somebody is trying to say that the Super Nintendo doesn't get credit for Chrono Trigger because it's also on PS1. Point is, let's not say PS1 games are PS2 games because they're not. Also, back to the point about Chrono Trigger, the PlayStation 1 has plenty of great RPGs on its own that it doesn't even need to be stealing them from other consoles. Unlike certain other consoles, anybody else catch their N64 doing this? But the PS1 certainly has a lot of great RPGs, being what many would consider to be the PlayStation's greatest strength. And given that RPGs tend to be one of the genres people are the most passionate about, try telling someone their favorite RPG is bad, and then tell me how long it took to get stabbed. I got this one from Kingdom Hearts. Only took 4 seconds. And now, I like Kingdom Hearts. But I'd put the PS1 right up there with the Super Nintendo in terms of both quality and quantity of RPGs. Which one somebody prefers often comes down to preference. What I can say for the PS1, though, is that it really pushed the genre forward with new ideas and approaches, which is fitting for the generation it was part of. Right as 3D games and CD technology were starting to really take hold, developers were inspired to try new things. The output of Squaresoft alone is almost hard to believe, given the number of bangers they released in roughly 5 to 6 years. This isn't even all of them. And regardless of what people think of Final Fantasy VII, it boosted the popularity of RPGs in the West. I mean, my goodness, I remember seeing somebody walking around in public holding their copy of Final Fantasy VII like it was a dog they were walking or something. But the popularity of Final Fantasy VII led to many more games in the genre being made and localized, with many developers trying new ideas, including Squaresoft themselves. Ever play a game quite like Parasite Eve before? Probably not, unless you've played Parasite Eve. influenced by Resident Evil for sure, but still very much a one-of-a-kind experience. Admittedly, RPGs were an acquired taste for myself. There were times when I questioned if I actually liked them or not, but thanks to the passion of friends and games like Valkyrie Profile that you've been looking at here, reassure me that I definitely do. Awkward voice acting included. You know I'm always down for awkwardness. I love this game to death, even if the PS1 version has sadly become unaffordable. But if anyone has had a hard time enjoying RPGs and still cares to try and see if they like them, I'd suggest the PS1's offerings. There's a lot of unique takes on the genre, more than any other console by far, and I consider this a huge plus for the PS1's library. But enough about the PS1's strengths, let's talk about where its game library is lacking. Looking here, oh, there are none. I found that even the things other consoles get more credit for over the PS1 still does well. The quirky mascot platformers of Nintendo, PS1's got Spyro and Crash Bandicoot. By the way, did you know that some people still confuse Crash Bandicoot with Banjo-Kazooie? If you're one of those people, then I guess you do, but if they were the same, then Banjo-Kazooie would have gotten the beautiful remake treatment that Crash Bandicoot got, and I wouldn't have to write these angry letters to Microsoft. Alright, and then what about the 2D prowess of the Sega Saturn and its excellent library of shoot-em-ups? Well, the fighting games were certainly lacking compared to Saturn, but beautiful 2D games could absolutely be found on the PS1. Looking at Rayman here, in terms of being something that's aesthetically pleasing to look at, I still think it might be one of the best looking games there is, even all these years later. And for shoot 'em ups, sure, the Saturn is straight fire, I'd say probably the best, but the PS1 has nothing to be ashamed of, including a lot of big hits in some of the biggest series. The PS1 simply has it all. The vast majority of game developers supported it at the time, which was a time when the gaming industry was starting to show tremendous growth. In short, tons of devs made games for it, and the timing worked out perfectly. Devs looked at the Nintendo 64 and thought, and looked at the Saturn and thought, Those are actual quotes, too. Devs weren't happy with Nintendo for choosing cartridges over CDs, as well as their prior reputation for being dirty dogs when it came to controlling and restrictive publishing, and many devs found Sega's Saturn console to be too tricky to develop for. So, most developers chose the PlayStation by default, even if they wouldn't have normally. Have you ever been at a social gathering and talked to somebody simply because they were not the person or people you were trying to ignore? Being the de facto console for video games is ideal and meant tons of different games for the PlayStation. If there's an experience you want to have on the original PlayStation, you can probably find it because it was supported so heavily. A console is nothing without support. Quick gander at the old console graveyard can tell you that, but a console is everything with support. To illustrate this point, including hardware, take a look at what we got here. The smaller version of the PS1 with a screen attached, playing the Japanese version of Raiden 2 in what's called Tate mode, where the screen is flipped onto its side in order to give the game its proper resolution and aspect ratio, all while being played with a Saturn controller made by Sega for the PlayStation that allows you to take advantage of its famously comfortable D-pad. And that's just right here, without seeing what's going on with my face while all of this is happening. To be fair, the Sega controller was technically made for the PS2, and given my parameters of not giving the PS2 credit for the PS1, I suppose I'll have to accept anybody who deems me a dirty dog for doing so. All this said, the one thing that the PS1 didn't do well is multiplayer and party games, at least when compared to the Nintendo 64, which I feel did this demonstrably better. But who needs friends when you got Ape Escape anyways? But yeah, the PS1 did have some good multiplayer games. just not enough that I feel compelled to make a strong case for it. Rather, I'll be going with the, well, nothing can be perfect and it's still really, really good anyways approach. Kinda like a nanner, as great as it is, not so great once you're finished and can't eat it anymore, or can you? Well, that settles it. PlayStation wins against everything except for nanners. Some people might also say that the PS1 loses to the reality of early 3D gaming, also known as ugly 3D gaming. But my counter to this is always that there were still lots of 2D games, whether fully or partially. Lots of popular series used pre-rendered backgrounds, which look really nice, and playing the games from this era on smaller screens, whether something like this or just a smaller TV, tends to make the games look just fine. But those are my thoughts. As always, I'd love to hear yours, so be sure to leave any comments you may have, vote for which console you'd like to have me battle versus everything next, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's the retro bird, oh yes, and he hopes that you like